I never thought I'd feel this way again. It's not after college, not after settling down, not after building a life with my wife. Emily. But here I am 30 years old, sitting in my car after work, gripping the steering wheel like it's the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. My heart is pounding. My thoughts are racing, and it's all because of her. Sophie, a small, red-haired angel who walked into my life and turned everything I thought I knew upside down. We worked together. She joined the team about 6 months ago, and from the moment she walked into the office, I felt something shift in me. At first, I ignored it. Just another new face, another coworker. But there was something about her. The way she laughed, not too loud, not forced, but real. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was deep in thought. The way her green eyes sparkled with something mischievous. When she caught me looking at her dot, I should have stopped myself. Should have put up a wall before things went too far, but I don't. And now I can't stop thinking about her. It started small, as these things always do. Casual conversations by the coffee machine. Shared jokes about our boss. A little too much eye contact during meetings. Then, one day, she asked me for help with something, an excuse. Really? She could have figured it out on her own, but she wanted me there? Close. I felt it in the way she lingered when I leaned over her desk. The way her breath hitched when my arm brushed against hers. She's married, so am I. But in that moment, none of that mattered. At home, Emily was as wonderful as ever. She made dinner, asked about my day, told me about hers. She laughed at the funny stories I told about work, the ones that didn't involve Sophie. She leaned against me on the couch as we watched TV. Her warmth, familiar and steady. And yet, felt nothing but guilt, because all I could think about was Sophie. The way she smiled at me today. The way her fingers brushed mine when I handed her a document. The way she looked at me like I was the only person in the room. It's ridiculous. I know it is. I have a good life, a stable marriage, a wife who loves me, and yet I feel like a damn teenager. My stomach twisting every time I hear Sophie's voice, my chest tightening every time she walks by. What the hell is wrong with me? I tell myself it's just a crush, not it'll pass. But deep down, I know better. Because when I wake up in the morning, before my brain is even fully awake, the first thought that crosses my mind isn't Emily, it's Sophie. I try to shake it. I bury myself in work, focusing on spreadsheets, reports, anything that will keep me distracted. But every time I glance up, I catch her looking at me. One afternoon, we stay late at the office. It's just the two of us, the overhead lights buzzing. Softly, the office empty and quiet. She sits across from me, biting her lip as she works through a problem on her screen. Need help? I ask. She looks up, and for a moment, there's something unreadable in her expression. Then she smiles. Yeah, I think I do. I move to her desk, standing close. Too close. I can smell her perfume, something light and sweet. She shifts in her chair, and our arms brush. The air between us thickens, heavy with something unsaid. This is dangerous. I should step away, but I down single quotes T instead. I watch as she turns her head slightly, her breath catching. Her green eyes flick to my lips, just for a second. But I notice, and she knows I notice. I should go, I say abruptly, stepping back. She exhales. Almost like she was holding her breath. Yeah, me too. We don't move. Then she nods, as if making a decision, and turns back to her screen. I take that as my cue to leave, grabbing my jacket and walking out of the office, my pulse racing. That night, lying in bed beside Emily, I stare at the ceiling. She's asleep already, her breathing soft and steady. I should be asleep too, but my mind won't quiet down. Because for the first time in my life, I'm terrified. Terrified of what I feel. Terrified of what I might do. And even more terrified of the fact that, despite knowing all the reasons I shouldn't, I don't want to stop. The next morning, I wake up exhausted. I barely slept. My mind kept replaying last night, the way Sophie looked at me, the way my body responded. I roll onto my side, watching Emily as she sleeps. She looks peaceful, unaware of the storm raging. Inside me, I should feel lucky. I should feel grateful. Instead, I feel like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing he should step back but leaning forward anyway, just to see how far he might fall. At work, I try to avoid Sophie. It lasts about an hour. She finds me in the break room, standing by the coffee machine, staring blankly as the dark liquid fills my cup. "Rough night?" she asks, her voice light, teasing. I glance at her, forcing a chuckle. "Something like that." She leans against the counter, close enough that I can smell her perfume again. "Yeah," she says softly, staring into her own cup. Me, too. The air between us shifts, charged and dangerous. She's not just making small talk, she's saying something without saying it. And I understand exactly what she means. I should end this right now. Instead, I change the subject. "Got any big weekend plans?" She hesitates, then smiles, but it doesn't reach her eyes. "My husband is taking me to his parents' house for the weekend. Emily wants to go hiking. She loves the outdoors." That sounds nice. It is. We stand there, silent, pretending this is just a normal conversation, but it's not. She finally sighs, pushing off the counter. I should get back to work. Yeah, me too. She turns to leave, but then pauses, just for a second. Then she walks away without looking back. I exhale sharply, gripping my coffee cup like it's the only thing keeping me grounded. This is getting out of hand. That weekend, Emily and I go hiking. She's in her element, smiling, taking pictures of the trees, the sky, the view. I try to focus on her, on us, on this life we built together. But in the back of my mind, I wonder what Sophie is doing. Is she laughing at one of her father-in-law's stories? Is she sitting at a dinner table, pretending everything is fine, just like I am? Emily takes my hand, squeezing it. "You're quiet today?" I smile at her, just tired. She nods, accepting the answer. She doesn't know I'm lying. I hate myself for it. Monday morning, Sophie walks in wearing a navy blue dress. Simple, nothing flashy. But I can't take my eyes off her. She notices Dot at lunch. She sits across from me in the break room. We aren't alone. There are others talking, laughing, scrolling through their phones. But in my head, it's just us. She toys with her fork, pushing her food around. "Did you have a nice weekend?" "It was good, you?" She shrugs. "It was fine." We lock eyes, and for a moment, I see a frustration, longing, something unspoken. And then, before I can say anything, she stands. "See you later." I watch her walk away, my chest tightening. I have to stop this. I have to, but I don't. A week later, we're both staying late again. It's unplanned, just bad timing. The office is empty. Just us and the quiet hum of computers. I glance at her. She glances at me. Neither of us says anything. I clear my throat. "You don't have to stay late, you know?" She gives me a small smile. "Neither do you." I don't have an answer for that. She leans back in her chair, crossing her arms. "This is stupid, isn't it?" I exhale. "Yeah, it is." We sit there, silent, both knowing exactly what we mean. Then she stands, grabbing her things. "Good night, Noah." I watch her walk away, and something inside me snaps. "Sophie." She stops, but doesn't turn around. I should tell her to forget this. To stop looking at me like that. To walk away before we destroy everything. But I don't say, "Do you want to get coffee tomorrow, outside of work?" She's still for a moment. Then, finally, she turns her head just enough for me to see her face. A slow, knowing smile spreads across her lips. "Yeah," she whispers, "I do." And just like that, I know I've already fallen. The next morning, I wake up earlier than usual. Emily is still asleep beside me, her hand resting lightly on my chest. I stare at the ceiling, my heart pounding for reasons I don't want to admit. Sophie and I agreed to meet for coffee before work. Just coffee. That's what I keep telling myself. I slip out of bed quietly, careful not to wake Emily. She stirs slightly, but doesn't open her eyes. I stand there for a second, watching her, guilt curling in my stomach like smoke. Then I leave. Sophie is already there when I arrive. It's a small cafe just a few blocks from the office neutral territory. She's sitting by the window, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, her red hair catching the morning light. She looks up as I walk in, and for a second, we just stare at each other. Then she smiles. "You're late." I check my watch. By 2 minutes. She shrugs, taking a sip of her coffee. "Still late." I shake my head, smirking as I sit down across from her. "So, do we acknowledge what we're doing here? Or do we pretend this is normal?" She exhales a soft laugh, looking down at her cup. "I don't know. What do you want to pretend?" I don't answer, because the truth is, I don't. She lifts her eyes to meet mine, and suddenly, the air between us feels different. Heavier. This is dangerous. I should leave, but I don't. We talk about nothing and everything work. Movies, music. The conversation flows easily, naturally. It's too naturally. At one point, she leans in slightly, resting her chin on her hand. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why me?" Caught off guard. "What do you mean?" She tilts her head, studying. "Me? You're married. I'm married. So why this?" I exhale slowly, running a hand through my hair. "I've been asking myself the same thing." She waits. I hesitate, then finally say, "Because you make me feel something I haven't felt in a long time. It's the truth." And by the look in her eyes, I know she understands. "Me too," she whispers. Neither of us says anything for a moment. The line between us, the one we've been dancing around for weeks, is thinning. I should end this now. Say something to push her away, to pull myself back to solid ground. Instead, I reach across the table and brush my fingers against hers. She doesn't pull away. By the time we get to work, everything feels different. The air between us is charged. Every glance, every touch, weighted with something unspoken. We're careful. We don't sit too close. We don't linger too long. But we both know what's happening. It's not just a crush anymore. It's not harmless, and neither of us is stopping it. Days pass, and the tension between us builds. Every touch feels like a spark. Every stolen glance is another step toward the edge. Then, one evening, it happens. We're the last ones in the office again. It wasn't planned, but it doesn't feel like an accident either. She's standing by the window, looking out at the city, her arms crossed. The room is dimly lit. The only sound, the distant hum of traffic. I stand behind her, close, but not touching. "Ever wonder what would have happened if we met before?" She asks quietly. I swallow hard. "Yeah, all the time." She turns to face me, and for a moment, we just stare at each other. Then, before I can stop myself, I reach up and brush a strand of hair from her face. She leans into my touch. And just like that, the line we swore we wouldn't cross disappears completely. The moment my lips met hers, the world seemed to tilt. For a second, there was nothing but her warmth, her scent. The way her fingers curled into my shirt, as though she'd been waiting for this as long as I had. It was electric, intoxicating. But the moment was fleeting. She pulled back first, her breathing uneven, her green eyes searching mine for, what? Regret? Reassurance? I couldn't tell. All I knew was the rush of adrenaline in my veins and the terrible, sinking realization of what we'd just done. I stepped back, raking a hand through my hair. "Sophie, I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know." She didn't need me to say it. We both knew what this meant. "I should go," she said, grabbing her bag. Her hands were shaking, and for the first time she looked as scared as I felt. "Sophie, wait," but she was already walking away, her heels clicking against the tiled floor, her red hair disappearing around the corner. I stood there, frozen, the taste of her still on my lips, and for the first time since this all began, I wondered if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. That night, I barely slept. Emily lay beside me, her breathing soft and steady, her hand resting lightly on my arm. It was comforting, familiar, and yet, I felt like I didn't deserve it. I kept replaying the kiss in my mind, over and over again. The way Sophie looked at me, the way her lips felt against mine, the way my body betrayed every rational thought I had. This wasn't just a harmless flirtation anymore. It was an affair. Maybe not in the physical sense, not yet, but emotionally. I was already too far gone, and Sophie felt it too. I could see it in her eyes, hear it in the way her voice broke when she said goodbye. I thought about calling her, texting her, something. But what would I say? I'm sorry. I can't do this. The truth was, I wasn't sorry. And I wasn't sure I wanted to stop. The next day at work, I avoided her. Or at least, I tried to. But Sophie wasn't making it easy. She wasn't obvious about it. No long stares. No lingering touches. But every time she walked by, I felt her presence like a current in the air. Every time she spoke, her voice seemed to cut through the noise around us, reaching me no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. By lunchtime, couldn't take it anymore. I found her in the break room, standing by the window with her coffee. She looked up as I walked in, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. Finally, I broke the silence. We need to talk. She nodded, setting her coffee down. Yeah, we do. I glanced around, making sure no one was nearby. Not here? After work, she hesitated, then nodded again. Okay. The hours dragged by. By the time the office cleared out, my nerves were frayed, my heart pounding. We met in the parking lot, away from the streetlights and the watchful eyes of coworkers. She leaned against her car, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. I stood a few feet away, my hands in my pockets, unsure of where to start. Sophie, I don't, she interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. Don't say you're sorry. I don't want to hear it. I frowned. I wasn't going to say that. She looked at me then, her green eyes sharp, almost challenging. Then what? Were you going to say? I exhaled slowly, running a hand through my hair. I don't know. That this is complicated. That I don't know how to handle it. That I can't stop thinking about you, even though I know I should. Her expression softened, and for a moment, she looked as lost as I felt. Noah, she said quietly, her voice trembling. What are we doing? I don't know, I admitted. I know I don't want to stop. She closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. This is insane. We're married. We have lives, families. I know, I said, stepping closer. But it doesn't change how I feel about you. Her eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I thought she might tell me to leave, to never speak to her again. But she de-joined single quotes. Instead, she whispered, I feel it too. The air between us was heavy, electric. I wanted to reach for her, to kiss her. Again, to lose myself in her, the way I had the night before. But I didn't case because as much as I wanted her, I couldn't ignore the weight of what we were doing. We need to figure this out, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her gaze dropping to the ground. Yeah, we do. We stood there in silence for a moment, the reality of our situation sinking in. Then she looked up at me, her green eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Good night, Noah, she said softly, climbing into her car. I watched as she drove away, the taillights disappearing into the distance. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the full weight of Quo. What we were doing, this wasn't a game anymore. This was real, and it was only going to get harder from here. For the next few days, Sophie and I kept our distance. We spoke only when necessary, kept our conversations brief and professional. If anyone at the office noticed the shift between us, they didn't say anything. But I felt it, every glance, every moment of silence between us was heavy with everything we weren't saying at night. I lay beside Emily, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I got here, wondering how long I could keep living this lie. Then, everything changed. It was a Friday afternoon. The office was buzzing, everyone eager for the weekend. I was in my office when I got a text from Sophie, meet me in the stairwell now. My stomach clenched. She hadn't texted me since the night in the parking lot. I hesitated, glancing at my office door, then back at my phone. I should ignore this, but I didn't. The stairwell was empty when I got there. The moment I stepped inside, Sophie grabbed my arm and pulled me into the corner, her eyes wild, her breathing uneven. Sophie, why? I can't do this anymore, she blurted, her voice breaking. Noah, I feel like I'm losing my mind. I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. I know, Me too. She shook her head. No, you don't understand, Asfin. He knows something's wrong. Keeps asking me why I've been acting different, why I'm distracted all the time. And I don't know what to say. My chest tightened. Did you tell him anything? No, but he's not stupid. Noah, he can feel it. She took a shaky breath. I went home last night, and he just looked at me. Like he was searching for something. And for a second, I thought she swallowed. I thought he knew. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I let it out. But he doesn't, right? She shook her head. Not yet. I ran a hand over my face. Sophie, what are we doing? Her eyes locked onto mine, filled with the same torment that had been eating away at me for weeks. I don't know, but I don't think I can keep pretending anymore. I knew what she meant. The weight of the secrecy, the guilt. The fear it was crushing us both. I should have told her we needed to stop. That this had gone too far. That it wasn't worth risking everything. But instead, I did the one thing I knew I shouldn't. I reached for her. She didn't resist. The moment my hands touched her face, she closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. Noah, she whispered. I kissed her, hard, desperate, like a man drowning and gasping for air. She kissed me back just as desperately, her fingers gripping my shirt, pulling me closer. For a few breathless moments, nothing else existed. No husbands, no wives. No consequences, just us. Then the stairwell door creaked open. We broke apart instantly, our breathing ragged, our hearts hammering. I turned my head just in time to see one of our coworkers, Mark, standing frozen in the doorway, his eyes wide. The silence was deafening. Mark's gaze flicked between us, his mouth opening slightly as if he was about to speak. But no words came out. Panic shot through me like ice water. Sophie's face drained of color. I took a step forward. Mark, but before I could finish, he turned and walked away, the stairwell door slamming shut behind him. Sophie let out a shaky breath, her hands flying to her mouth. Oh my God, she whispered. Oh my God. It felt like I was going to be sick. We need to do something, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, swallowing hard. I'll talk to him. Her eyes were wide with fear. And say what? That he didn't just see what he clearly saw? I had no answer for that, because we both knew there was no taking this back. I found Mark in the break room later that afternoon, stirring a cup of coffee absently, his face unreadable. I stepped inside, my pulse hammering. Hey man, he didn't look up. Hey. Silence stretched between us. Finally, I exhaled. Look about earlier. Mark stirred his coffee once more, then set the spoon down with deliberate slowness. Don't I blinked. What? He finally met my eyes. I don't want to know. I don't want to be involved, but whatever you're doing, Noah. He leaned in slightly. You need to be careful. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Mark, he shook his head, grabbing his coffee and walking out of the room without another word. I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, my mind racing. We had dodged a bullet, for now, but deep down, I knew this wasn't going away. And if we weren't careful, it was all going to come crashing down. That night, Emily and I went out to dinner. She had made reservations at our favorite restaurant, something she did every few months to keep things special. I sat across from her, watching her laugh at something on her phone, completely oblivious to the chaos inside me. For a split second, thought about telling her everything, ending it before it spiraled further, but then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Her eyes warm, full of love, and I knew I couldn't. So instead, I smiled back at her, and I continued. The lie. The days that followed were suffocating. Mark hadn't said anything yet, but the weight of what he saw loomed over me like a storm cloud. Every time I passed him in the hallway, every time our eyes met in a meeting, I braced myself for the moment he'd pull me aside and say, I told your wife. But he didn't. That didn't make the guilt any easier to bear. Sophie and I stopped meeting in private. We barely spoke beyond what was necessary. But none of that changed the truth. We had crossed the line. and we could never go back. And then the storm finally broke. It was a Tuesday evening when everything fell apart. I had just walked through the front door when I knew something was wrong. Emily was standing in the living room, her arms crossed, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Her face was pale. Her eyes, usually so warm, so full of love, were cold. "Where were you?" she asked. I frowned, setting down my bag. "I was at work," she nodded slowly, her jaw tight. "Mark's wife called me." The words landed like a sledgehammer. I went still. "What?" Her fingers curled around her phone. Mark told her what he saw, and she told me. My mouth went dry, everything inside me screamed to deny it, to spin a lie, to salvage what was left. But I couldn't, because the look in Emily's eyes told me she already knew the truth. "Noah," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Is it?" True silence. I opened my mouth, closed it, and then, finally, I whispered, "Yes." Her breath hitched. She staggered back like I had struck her. I stepped forward instinctively. "Emily, I don't." Her voice was sharp, shaking. "Don't say anything." She pressed a hand to her mouth, her entire body trembling. I had never seen her like this. Never seen her so broken, my stomach twisted painfully. "Emily, please." She shook her head violently. "How long?" I swallowed hard. "It wasn't," I hesitated. "It wasn't long." Her laugh was hollow, bitter. "Right, just long enough to throw away everything we built." The words cut deeper than I thought possible. I had no defense, no excuse, because she was right. Her eyes filled with tears. She wiped them away quickly, like she didn't want me to see her cry. "I want you to leave," she whispered. The air left my lungs. "Emily, get out." Her voice cracked. Raw with pain, I hesitated for only a second. Then I turned and walked out the door. I drove without a destination, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles turned white. The reality of what had just happened was setting in, sinking into my bones. I had lost her. Emily, my wife. My best friend, the woman who had stood by me for years, who had built a life with me, trusted me, was gone. And I had no one to blame but myself. I don't know how I ended up at Sophie's house, but when she opened the door and saw my face, she knew. Her own face crumpled. "Oh God." I nodded numbly. "Emily knows." She exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her forehead. "Noah." Ran a hand over my face. "I don't know what to do." She looked at me, and I could see the war raging inside her. Then she stepped aside. "Come in." We sat on her couch in silence for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "I should tell my husband." Looked at her. "You don't have to." She let out a shaky breath. "Yes, I do." She turned to face me then, her green eyes filled with something heavy. "Noah, what are we doing?" I had no answer. I wanted to tell her that this was worth it. That everything we had done, everything we had lost, was for something real. But I wasn't sure anymore. Sophie swallowed hard. I thought, maybe, if everything fell apart, that would mean we were supposed to be together. But now she closed her eyes, shaking her head. "Now all I feel is guilt." The words hit like a punch to the gut, because I felt the same. I had convinced myself that what we had was special, that it meant something. And maybe it did, but was it worth the wreckage we had left behind? She reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "I think we made a mistake." I let out a shaky breath. "Yeah," double quotes silence. Then she whispered, "I think we should end this." Closed my eyes. I knew she was right, but that didn't make it hurt any less. The next few weeks were a blur. Emily refused to speak to me. I moved into a small apartment across town. Sophie told her husband the truth. He left. We saw each other at work, but we didn't speak beyond what was necessary. There was no more stolen glances, no more late nights, no more whispered confessions, just silence. And maybe that was the cruelest part of all, because for all the fire, the passion, the need that had drawn us together in the end, all that was left was ashes. One night, months later, I found myself standing outside my old house, Emily's house, now. The lights were on. She was inside. For a moment, I considered knocking, telling her how sorry I was, how much I missed her, but then saw a shadow move behind the curtain, someone else. My chest tightened. I had already lost her, and she had moved on. Turned and walked away. This was my consequence, and I had no choice but to live with it. That's the end of today's story. Did things turn out the way you thought, or were there some surprises along the way? Share your thoughts in the comments side. Love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to hit the like button. And if you haven't joined the community yet, now's the perfect time. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're always the first to catch new stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next adventure.